Thank you for attending. Thank you for coming. Today we have a great guest in our community, and I'm very grateful for his acceptance to come and speak to us in our little town, East Fishkill. My name is Councilman Marinaro. We put this event together with our Assemblyman Kira Michael Lawler, and we have today Senator of the United States, Mr. Buckley, who, as I said, thank you again for taking the time to come and speak to us. Briefly, how did this come about? I was driving home one night, and I was listening to John Batchelor's show, and was interviewing the senator, and I said, what a great message that he's giving out. And so I thought that it would be a great honor to really listen to him and share his experience that he had in the Senate and bring it to us, because what he has to say, it really is important for us to bring back in our community and share with the rest of the people, because these are really where we are today and maybe where we should not be.
Well, thanks for coming out today, everyone. Beautiful summer Saturday. There's a million things you could be doing, and everyone in this room is concerned about their community, and I appreciate you coming to share your concerns, and hopefully we'll take away some information that can help our community. Hopefully we get the mic to stop humming also. I mentioned to Senator Buckley when he came in a few minutes ago, but for conservatism in New York State, I probably never would have been born, which sounds a little out there, but my parents met in 1964 working on the Goldwater campaign, which was kind of the birth of the conservative movement in New York State and in some ways nationally. And one of the crowning achievements of that New York conservative movement was Senator Buckley's election a few years later. So I want to give you a brief biography before Senator Buckley speaks, and it's quite a biography, really incredible. James L. Buckley was born in New York City in 1923, grew up in rural Connecticut, received his bachelor's degree from Yale. Following his service as a naval officer in World War II, he returned to New Haven to secure his law degree. After several years in private practice, he joined a group of small companies engaged in oil exploration abroad. He was elected to the United States Senate in 1970 as the candidate of New York's Conservative Party. He has since served as an Undersecretary of State in the Reagan administration, as president of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty in Munich, Germany, and most recently as a judge on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit. He retired in 2000 and now lives in his hometown of Sharon, Connecticut, which is not too far from the Dutchess County border up near Millbrook. Without any further delays, Senator Buckley.
Meeting with you here in this community hall brings back, ye gods, memories of 40 years ago when it was my privilege to represent the great state of New York in the United States Senate. I suspect that my opposition to a federal government bailout of the bankrupted New York City may have had something to do with my failing to be reelected that year, despite the fact I think I had over 60% vote in upstate New York, an enlightened part of the state always. But I have felt throughout my public service that it was supremely important to preserve the division between federal and state responsibilities that was written into our Constitution. The importance of that division is at the heart of the book I'll be discussing in this talk, very splendid one. In any event, the book makes a proposal, and the division of these responsibilities is at the heart of my book, which proposes a reform that at one stroke would balance the federal budget, relieve Congress of a major distraction from its critical responsibilities, and allow states to conduct their own affairs free of federal interference. But before going into the details, let me first provide some background regarding the institutional problems we see in Washington today. Too few people appreciate the speed with which we have been converting ourselves, the federal government, into an all-encompassing administrative state. In 1935, at the beginning of the New Deal, the United States Code consisted of a single volume of statutes. Thanks to the New Deal and Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, by 1970, when I was elected to the Senate, the Code had grown to 11 volumes. Today, there are 34 of them, and they in turn are supplemented by 235 volumes, or over 175,000 pages of fine print regulations that have the force of law and now reach into every corner of our lives. This dramatic expansion of federal authority has undermined Congress's ability to operate effectively. While administrative agencies are staffed by specialists who can focus on a discrete area of responsibility, legislators are supposed to bring an informed judgment to bear on every bill that comes before them for a vote. Today, that is impossible, and it has been impossible for decades. Shortly after my election to the Senate, someone handed me a study of Congress that had concluded that the workload of the average congressional office had doubled every 5 years since 1935. As Congress once worked at a leisurely pace and was in session just 5 or 6 months a year, the members could take the earlier increases in stride simply by working longer hours and extending the length of congressional sessions. By the time I arrived in Washington, those extra hours and months had long since been exhausted, and life in Congress had been turned into a treadmill. By every report, the situation today is infinitely worse. There is little meaningful floor debate, little time for study and reflection. Staffs patch together 1,000-page bills that few members of Congress have the time to read. Because thoughtful legislation requires attention to detail that its members can no longer devote, responsibility for more and more of the essential legislative provisions are delegated to agencies which then spin out the implementing regulations. As a result, too often today, Congress has little understanding of how much of the latest mega bill will cost, or how it will operate in the real world. And today, those agencies administer so vast a number of programs that effective congressional oversight is simply impossible. That, I believe, is at the root of what we have in Washington today: a legislature that can no longer legislate responsibly, an administrative establishment that too often exceeds its authority, and an executive that, out of frustration or imperial impulse, increasingly feels free to rule by edict. That is why one of our most urgent tasks, I believe, is to find ways to reduce the scope of federal responsibilities to a size that would allow Congress to once again serve as an effective, deliberative body, one that is capable of enacting laws its members understand and delegating administrative responsibilities it can oversee. To that end, my book has the temerity to suggest that Congress abandon a category of legislation to which its members have become addicted. Specifically, I refer to grants and aids programs that provide subsidies to states and their subdivisions for a vast range of purposes that are acknowledged to be the exclusive responsibility of the states. I've long known such programs existed because on the rare occasion that one was proposed back in the 1970s when I was in the Senate, I routinely voted against it as involving matters that were none of Congress's business. It was only recently, however, that I became aware of how pervasive they now are and to the political reasons for their proliferation. My epiphany began a dozen years ago when, on my retirement and move to Connecticut, I subscribed to a nearby city's daily paper. I soon found it filled with reports of federal grants in support of an astonishing variety of purely local purposes. These included, for example, a $1.5 million grant of scarce highway trust funds for the rehabilitation of a vandalized railroad station that had long since been converted to private non-transportation uses. Nearly $2 million to replace a one-lane bridge connecting two small communities a dozen miles from my home, and a $500,000 grant to widen two streets leading to a school. That last is my favorite example of congressional imagination. Those sidewalks were being widened courtesy of an act of Congress titled the Federal State Routes to School Program. Its explicit purpose is to fight juvenile obesity by encouraging children to bike or walk to school. I'm not sure the parents of the children attending that school felt that that was the most cost-effective way to keep their children slim. But never mind, you don't turn down Santa Claus, even if the money he distributes comes from the taxes you pay or from debt your children will have to repay. Congress finds its authority to create such programs in a 1937 Supreme Court construction of the Constitution's spending clause, which empowers it to spend money, quote, to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. The mischief lies in those words, general welfare. The Supreme Court recently summarized that holding as enabling Congress in pursuit of its understanding of what will serve the general welfare to use federal funds to, quote, induce the states to adopt policies that the federal government itself could not impose. To put it another way, the court has licensed Congress to bribe the states to adopt federal directives on how they are to discharge their own responsibilities. And because grants programs deal with matters beyond Congress's constitutional authority, the court has made it plain that participation in them must be voluntary. It may not be coerced. The Supreme Court's 1937 decision opened up vast new opportunities for doing what members of Congress are always looking for, and that is new ways to scratch constituent backs. It was not until the Lyndon Johnson administration began invading areas that had formerly been considered off limits to the federal government, however, that those members came to realize the political opportunities that this new court precedent had opened up for them. Thus, while at the outset of the administration, of the Johnson administration, there were just 132 such programs, today there are more than 1,100 of them. In 1970, those programs dispersed $24 billion. This year, they will disperse almost $641 billion, which will amount to 1/6 of federal spending, and all for purposes that are the exclusive business of the states. Those figures, however, do not begin to reflect the total dollar and institutional costs of those programs. Because the grants come with the most detailed instructions, their total out-of-pocket cost to the federal fisc includes not just the amounts distributed, but the expenses incurred in drafting regulations, screening grants applications, and ensuring that recipients comply with the federal rulebook. The cost of that additional work has been estimated at $1 for every 10 distributed, for a total of about $64 billion in additional spending this year. The major cost to the federal government, however, may well be the diversion of congressional attention from the critical issues that only Congress can address. Studies confirm that its members spend heroic amounts of time at their work. Those studies also suggest that they spend a major portion of their time attending to constituent concerns that unfortunately tend to be matters that are the responsibilities of governors or city mayors rather than on those of a congressman. Matters such as public housing, job training, education, homelessness, and unfilled potholes. That last comes to mind because a recent senator from the state, his attention to urban minutiae actually earned him the nickname of Senator Pothole. But those are precisely the kinds of matters for which those 1,100 grants programs are addressed. The costs at the state level are so large and diverse that it is impossible in this presentation to describe them all or to give an adequate idea of their cumulative impact. But here are some of the kinds to which I refer. To ensure compliance with the detailed regulations governing their use, federal grants add layers of local and state administrative expenses to the costs of the subsidized projects. They also impose one-size-fits-all requirements on states as different as Arizona and New York, thus preventing their officials from applying common sense and local knowledge in securing the best value for the money spent. Furthermore, they can trigger a host of unfunded mandates, such as the Bacon-Davis Act's requirement that the equivalent of union wages be paid for construction work involving the expenditure of a single federal dollar, which can add as much as 20% to the cost of the work. These programs also undermine accountability because state officials bound by federal regulations can't be held responsibility for the costs and failures of the projects they manage. And because those regulations are made by distant federal bureaucrats, frustrated citizens who are directly affected by them have lost their ability to decide how their tax dollars are to be used. A critical problem is the way the grants distort state priorities. Let me cite just one recent example that came to my attention. In a remarkable feat of grantsmanship, last summer, Connecticut drew on 6 separate highway programs to accumulate an 80.2% federal financing for a controversial $500 million, 9.4-mile busway between 2 cities that on completion are supposed to save an estimated 13,000 commuters a dozen or so minutes a day. As the Hartford Current observed when Washington approved the last of these grants, and I quote, Monday's infusion of $275 additional dollars made Governor Malloy's critical support for the risky project awfully easy. It was only then that the state felt justified in committing its $113 million to the 9.4-mile busway's cost. But that meant that that money would not be available to help repair what a contemporaneous Associated Press article described as 200 Connecticut bridges that are in danger of collapse on the failure of a single vital component, including 49 that are crossed by 1.8 million vehicles a day. But priorities be damned. State officials have proven unable to resist the seductive offer of federal dollars or recirculated dollars for every one of their own. This litany of costs notwithstanding, advocates of federal grants argue that they are warranted for 2 reasons. The first is that the federal government is able to attract far greater expertise than the states. That is no doubt true, but it begs the question as to whether academic prowess trumps the hands-on experience and personal accountability on which the states once relied. In fact, I have found no evidence that federal expertise has improved the quality of state and local services, but there is ample evidence of its failure to do so. To cite one example, The feds first became involved in education in a significant way 50 years ago with the enactment of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965. Yet, as Andrew Coulson has demonstrated in his exhaustive 2014 study, State Education Trends, during the succeeding decades, there has been no improvement in the quality of education nationally, despite a tripling of inflation-adjusted dollars spent per child. On the other hand, about the only encouraging developments in the field of education, such as vouchers and charter schools, have been the results of state and community initiatives. The advocate's second argument is that federal grants redistribute money from the wealthier states to the poorer ones, thus enabling the latter to maintain appropriate standards in such key areas as education. That is a seductive argument because the per capita income of the 10 poorest states is only 67.6% of that of the 10 richest. Variations in state cost of living, however, can muddy the analytical waters. To cite an extreme example, Mississippi's per capita income is 75% of Hawaii's, but its cost of living is only 55% of the latter's. I doubt, though, that anyone will suggest that Mississippians who live in our poorest state should send care packages to Hawaii, which is our 17th wealthiest. Redistribution is thus a weaker argument than it appears. But if redistribution is indeed a proper function of the federal government, there is a far better way to achieve that goal without imposing webs of federal regulations on all the states, rich and poor alike. The federal government can simply provide the have-not states with block grants, having the sole requirement that the recipients use the money for welfare or education or some other specific purpose. Under that approach, Washington would not be telling the states how to meet their responsibilities. Advocates of the programs also assert that because states participate in them voluntarily, they cannot complain about the costs and conditions that flow from the grants. Experience, however, has demonstrated that congressional bribes are very, very hard to resist. Money from Washington is still regarded as free, and state officials are delighted to accept grants, strings and all, rather than having to justify the full cost of projects they freely undertake with federal subsidies. What makes declining grants particularly difficult, however, is the fact that if a state does not participate in a program, its share of the money that is derived in whole or in part from its own taxpayers, will go elsewhere. Given these realities, it is hard to escape the conclusion that federal grants are inherently coercive, inherently unconstitutional. That is true even though 23 states have refused to participate in Obamacare's expansion of Medicaid coverage, but that is an exception that proves the rule. Having experienced the very substantial collateral costs of their existing Medicaid coverage, those states have simply declined to compound them. There is only one way to resolve the problems that have resulted from Congress's preoccupation with these programs, and that is to terminate all of them. They must all go because none is free of the costs I have described. But because those federal transfers now constitute about 30% of state revenues, Congress cannot cut off the flow of funds overnight. I therefore propose that it terminate the programs by converting all the grants the states and localities are currently receiving into single, no-string-attached block grants, one for each state, that would be phased out of a period of a half dozen or so years. That would allow Congress and the states the time to adjust their respective tax codes to accommodate the successive reductions in the federal transfers. That, in sum, is my book's modest proposal, a reform that at one stroke would reduce federal spending by 1/6, rid Congress of a major distraction from its essential national responsibilities, and restore the people's ability to control their own state and local affairs. I realize, of course, that it is one thing to propose a major reform and quite another to secure its adoption. It will be especially difficult in this case because it will meet with predictable opposition in Congress, and because too few people are yet aware that a problem exists that is in urgent need of reforming. As it happens, however, this is a particularly propitious time to seek a reform of the kind I propose. Recent headlines concerning incompetence and worse at the IRS, Veterans Affairs, and other federal agencies has undermined the myth that Washington necessarily knows best, and confidence in the federal government is at an all-time low. It also appears that Americans will still understand the virtues of the Constitution's allocation of governmental responsibilities. According to a survey of 2013 polling data, today's Americans believe that state and local governments are best able to handle the following responsibilities by the indicated percentages. Housing by 82% of those polled, transportation 78%, education 75%, and welfare 69%. Those are precisely the kinds of responsibilities that the Constitution has reserved to the states, the kinds that federal agencies have taken over. It will take time, I know, for the merits of my proposal to sink in, but the facts are there. If enough Americans learn of the grants program's true cost, they will know that they have everything to gain from their termination, both as citizens and as taxpayers. And as we have learned in the past, an aroused electorate can achieve political miracles. Nor should we give up on Congress. Confronted with an objective examination of 50 years of experience with those grants, members on both sides of the aisle may come to stigmatize those programs just as they have the earmarks of recent history. As you will recall, earmarks consisted of provisions snuck into legislation that ordered federal funding of specific state projects, such as the notorious Bridge to Nowhere. They had become so popular a form of pork that their number rose from 3,023 in 1996 to 15,877 in 2006, a five-fold increase in just 10 years. Nevertheless, in the year 2010, a persistent senator was able to shame his colleagues into suspending the practice, and it remains suspended. What is required is that the merits of the proposal be known and debated, and it is my hope that my book will trigger that debate. And I want to thank Assemblyman Lalo and all of you here for this opportunity you've given me to present the case. Thank you.
If you have questions, and you're nice to me, I'll call on you and you can ask a question. Yes, sir.
Hopefully it's a simple one. You started off and you said that the general clause or the
Spending clause.
right of in the Constitution, which is a clause that is secondary to the basic definition in the Constitution, especially as enumerated under Section 1.8. But it's 19.
It is part of the tax and spend clause. It's often referred to in this context as the spending clause. But it specifically authorizes the federal government to raise money.
Understand.
Yeah.
But my point is that the words have specific meaning. Legal words, even more specific meaning, but still in all they're ambiguous.
Yeah.
Logic, however, isn't necessarily. that ambiguous. So if I got a primary set of criteria that says this is what you are restricted to, why would the founders create a clause that says you can circumvent all of that with this clause?
I'm going to nominate you for the Supreme Court. And this is the great argument that went on between Madison and Hamilton in the early years. And for the first 150 years, by and large, we went by the interpretation you made. It was only when the New Deal came in that this twist was thrown in there with these dramatic consequences.
I think you made a great point there, Brian. Your brother Bill famously said he'd rather be governed by the first 100 names in the phone book than the Harvard faculty. And that's especially true if you're looking at the phone book for the 105th Assembly District. We'd love to have the wisdom of the people in this district. Yes, sir, in the back.
Yeah, Brian, I'll vote for you. You know, there's a piece in there, you said 1937, there's a clause in there for the general welfare of the United States. You said of the United States. You didn't say of the people. And that's how it is written in the United States. It is of the people. So why the hell are they giving all this stuff to the people? It's not really, you know, that should be separated. It should be to keep the United States floating, not every person floating. My reading of the Constitution.
It's pretty good. The general clause, the language, general welfare, was traditionally interpreted to mean that the money spent for the purposes that were enumerated would apply generally and not single out the state of New Jersey at the expense of other states and things of that sort.
Great. Mike Kuzmich, Town of Wappinger Councilman.
Yes, first I do want to thank everybody being from the neighborhood town of Wappinger to invite you here. And also thank you and your family. We owe you a great debt of gratitude. I mean, basically, if it wasn't for you and your family, I don't know where the Conservative Party would be. You've done so much to further the conservative cause and issues, and it's very encouraging to see you still out there speaking and writing books, and I hope we see more of that, so I thank you for that. And now to my question. You alluded to at the beginning of your presentation the idea of these administrative policies. And I don't think a lot of people realize that many times Congress adopts laws and they pretty much say, here's a general law, administrative agency, you enforce it. We don't really want to know how you do it, you just do it. And these administrative agencies, obviously, they last out administrations, elections, and that bureaucracy remains, and they continue to make these laws and they pass these mandates that affect businesses and our governments. And I mean, obviously it's a daunting task, but these types of rules and regulations that really go, you know, without any oversight cause just as much problems as these grants that you mentioned. Do you have any suggestions or ideas on how we counter that?
Well, I hope that one day the Supreme Court, and I hope properly constituted, will take on the question of an unconstitutional delegation of legislative responsibilities.
Yes.
And it's got, in so many areas, it's gone way beyond that.
Yes.
Again, because Congress doesn't have the time to do a proper job of writing laws.
Yes.
I'd just like to follow up on that, because that's a very good point. And as the Senator and I were talking before we started today, about these agencies, bureaucracy tends to self-perpetuate. And once you bring on a law, you say, okay, here, enact the law and operate it, then these things become actually self-perpetuating bureaucracies. And we know the morass dealing with any of these paperwork within, and I would say the lack of common sense dealing with any of these agencies. And I would just question, if a congressman wanted to vote against it, you still have to dismantle the bureaucracy. I just see a huge challenge for Congress in that, and I would certainly hope that they can accomplish it, because what we have to deal with is just mind-boggling with the paperwork, the minutiae. And to your point, I have to agree that you're saying there's kind of a battle between the federal government and the states are far more very equipped to address our issues than the federal government is. It's just a huge federal government overreach.
And people on the ground know what really needs to be done, not what Congress wants them to do. They know. what things cost, what will work and what won't work.
Yeah, absolutely.
All those sensible things that the people who gave us our Constitution understood.
Other question?
If you-
Go ahead.
I was just like on that, I'd like to give you a quick example of that. We had Hurricane Irene came through this area probably 5 or 6 years ago, and wiped out one of our roads, wiped out one of our bridges, and we had to rebuild it. We rebuilt it. It cost about $160,000 or $80,000. Then the federal government teamed with the state government, so DEC came in and FEMA came in, and all these important people came down and looked at the project. And we submitted all the paperwork, and it was a stack of about 8 inches of paper. I mean, it was a good stack of paperwork. So we submitted the paperwork, and we're waiting. And about 3 months later, we get a letter saying, oh, somehow we lost your paperwork. Could you resubmit? So now we have a policy, whenever we deal with the federal or state government, we make 4 copies. So we made up another copy, and it was mind-boggling the people we had to meet with over and over. We finally got reimbursed, I think, 2 years ago. And thank goodness we had the resources to do the job at the time. Had we had to wait for the funding from the federal and state government, we would still be driving around that road. So it's mind-boggling.
Got a question there, yeah?
In the town level, grant money is very appealing. It's like Christmas candy. You can't keep politicians away from it. How do you suggest deterring elected officials from going to the grants?
It's a very hard thing. This way, once the system is there, there's every incentive to spend it. I think you'll only be able to start discouraging people when people realize that they're getting their own money back with a tremendous surcharge. They're not going to be able to spend it the way they want, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All the points I think I tried to make. The only way you can cure the system is the Herculean one of getting that category of legislation outlawed. And I'm happy to say that there are some people in Washington who have read my book, who know how to do things in Washington, who believe that it will be possible to actually persuade Congress in time that this is a hell of a bad idea, a waste of their time, and I get the change made at the congressional level. That will take years to accomplish, but you've got to start somewhere. They've actually drawn up a plan that calls for the establishment of a tax-free corporation to do the research and pepper Congress and the lobbying and all the rest of it. One of the ideas is to identify particular programs that a number of governors hate and have them join in a lawsuit to challenge the constitutionality on the basis that these programs are in fact coercive, and to get the Supreme Court to review it again after 70 years. But I do believe that this is the most effective way in which you can start making a major change for the better in how we govern ourselves.
Right, but there's still 2 issues there that I keep coming across. The first being at the town level. You explain to an individual that you're being overtaxed in order for the grant money to be accrued in the first place.
Yeah.
So you're getting your own money back for pennies on the dollar with strings and conditions attached to it, which usually affect zoning, which basically just run your local businesses right into the ground.
Yeah.
They've got to put in curbing. They've got to go through an aesthetics review on the appearance of their building and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
So that's problem number 1. People's done nothing. Well, I should say that people are also very interested in getting some of that money back because we paid for it in the first place.
Yeah.
The other dilemma is the federal government. The federal government has a complete and total lust for power. And once again, if you look at Westchester County with Rob Astorino's battle with HUD.
Yeah.
HUD, once they start doling out these block grants, they want to take over your town zoning.
Exactly. Well, the problem is, I think that most people living in New York State and 49 other states are not aware of how costly, arbitrary, and distorting these programs are. They just take it for granted, money comes and it's being used for a profit. They are not familiar with the program, with the problems you described. I think the challenge that you and others have is to get these complaints and these descriptions of the cost, institutional and monetary costs of these programs, into the news, into stories, into articles, so that your citizens become aware that this isn't free money.
One to the other.
Questions?
That's two questions, you gotta give me $5.
Okay. This one might be worth $5. If the senator might opine on his feelings about an Article 5 convention.
That is, I think, might be necessary. I think one problem we have, which I allude to in the back of the book, I think, additional suggestions kind of department, term limitations. We have the service in Congress, which used to be pretty well limited by happenstance to 2 terms and so forth, as part-time jobs, have become careers. And all kinds of trimming of votes will happen to protect that career. And I suspect the only way you can actually achieve term limitations would be through Article 5 amendment. And the fact is that the polling data suggests that 3/4 of the American people would like to impose those limits. And in fact, 21 states had actually adopted laws limiting the terms of the people that sent to Washington until the Supreme Court said, sorry, that's not your prerogative to decide who's going to come to the national government. So I think the situation could be ripe if you could get that movement going.
Thank you.
Dominic?
Senator, thank you for coming. I have a question on voter apathy. How has it changed since you won as a conservative to today? Voter apathy.
Oh,
They're never apathetic when I'm running. I don't know what it is.
That
I might
explains
say, I was out of the elective business for about 39 years. So not something I focus on. No, it is a real problem, and I think part of it is a feeling of helplessness. You vote to get the people you like at the state and local level, and something is done with their money, recirculated, they don't particularly like it, don't think it works. And then you've got one of the problems of what's happening in Congress. As people no longer have time to think things through, discuss, understand, and communicate within the institution, all the responses have become political responses having nothing to do with the merits of a particular position. I don't know what you do about that overnight. I frankly don't.
I have a question, Senator. You mentioned early in your remarks that you took a stand against the federal bailout of New York City, and it may have cost you the election.
And maybe people didn't like me.
You never know. But a few years later, President Ford, there's a summarized in a famous headline, said "Drop dead to New York," and a lot of people think that allowed New York, or forced New York City to get its house in order to a degree. It may have saved New York City from itself. I'd be interested in your thoughts.
It may have cost him the election. It may have helped cost me my election, as there were flyers in the last month being handed out in Grand Central Station with that headline, and underneath it said, "And Buckley is the pallbearer." But New York State had to take charge, which it did. Basically, it ran New York City for a number of years. It had no choice. It would have had a choice if money had come in from Washington. And in point of fact, I had, for about a month before that headline, President Ford, going around the country, was using New York as a whipping boy, talking about this terrible state of affairs and the rest of it. And I managed to get to talk to him 5 days before that headline and said, Mr. President, this is not good for you politically because you got Nassau County and Westchester County and so on who will not appreciate it. But number two, express sympathy for the people of New York who are the victim of their own bad politics. Yeah. And he asked the guy who was next to him who wrote his speeches to take notes. And I looked at the television when he was making this announcement and I said, oh my God.
Questions? Yes.
During that same period that you were in, I was running the congressional staff in New York. During that period, if you remember, Jimmy Carter was shoveling money out of the White House like crazy. And they were granted to individuals, particularly in the health field, they were granted to particular local, the federal government come in and grant it to a local institution or whatever. When Ronald Reagan came in, we went to block grants,
yes,
which saved a tremendous amount of money on the federal government,
yeah,
which had X amount of dollars, which really constrained the amount of money that each individual grantee could get.
yeah.
And they did that an additional, they imposed an additional restriction by not giving to local, that it was totally done by the state of New York, say in our case, was done by the state of New York. My question really is, do you think if we went back to that system?
Yes, and I discuss it slightly in the book. And this, incidentally, if you did that, it would be, instead of phasing out block grants, instead of, you might say, keep them as a distribution means, but no strings attached,
right,
that would reduce congressional resistance, and I'd be very sympathetic to that happening. The problem I have has to do with human nature, and that is what happened with those Reagan block grants is Congress started yielding to the urge to put little conditions here and there.
Right. Yeah.
And so you rapidly went to the old system.
Yeah.
So if you could find some way to ensure you wouldn't backslide, that would do it.
Also on term limits, there's a counter argument that those people that if you impose term limits, that you might, particularly in this atmosphere, you might have people going into their own business in the last 2 years or the last 3 years of their stay in Washington. So I take it you don't agree with that?
I not really, no. That you could control through legislation.
Senator, just a quick question. As town supervisor, we fill the potholes, we have police force, we have recreation and facilities such as this, technical water systems, free sewer systems, and we have about a $10 billion budget. But every now and then you come across a problem that's larger than us. A dam that was built, say, in the early 1900s, that's in a difficult spot that nobody owns, that might need rehabilitation. It could be a safety concern or matters of that. I mean, this is why I look to the state, to the federal government for funding. I cannot tax the people in my town to fix this dam because, say, the cost is going to be $3 or $5 million. But it is appropriate to approach a higher level of government because we can't do that at our level.
You have the state government. You have a state government, it can tax its people.
Yeah.
And if it said, let's keep the federal taxes here, it would have more than enough to handle your problem.
Exactly. Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Yep.
I have a litmus test that I use to support congressmen. I will not support any congressman that votes to raise the debt ceiling. And I don't want to put you on the spot, but when you were in Congress, did you ever vote to raise the debt ceiling? And what are your feelings on that issue?
My answer will shock you. And that is, I voted to do away with, I introduced an amendment to do away with debt ceilings because it became because you have to pay your bills. You already spent the money, you've already committed the money. If you have to pay your bills, it became a vehicle for attaching all kinds of unrelated provisions that would never have been voted for on their own because they're just not unpopular. But they did get passed when I was around. You have to control spending. And you do that but through the appropriation business, to what you allow the Department of Defense to spend, the Department of Agriculture, and all the rest of them. But I just don't see how we can say we're not going to pay the bills we have already incurred.
Well, from what I've heard, enough money is coming in to pay the bills. We just don't, we keep borrowing this money, that it just keeps raising, and inflation goes up, and some people believe that we're on a course to an economic collapse because there is no control.
We are borrowing the money because we've authorized the expenditure of the money, and we need, we're either going to tax people to the point of view that we destroy the economy, or borrow money while we're still not Greece, but we're headed that way. One man's opinion.
You would advocate balanced budget,
I do.
but not specifically.
Not that way, no.
The spending.
You
Mr.
calculate
Griffith,
a spending.
red line. I'll get Bob Horton, our GOP chair in town here.
Senator Buckley, it's been many, many years since the last time I heard you speak, back when you were in office, and I was a much younger man. But I can't tell you how happy I am to see that you're as persuasive and compelling a speaker today as you ever were. I am just so happy to have this chance to be here and listen to you. And I got to tell you, you and your brother were two great heroes of mine when I was growing up.
Bless you.
So I am so... Is there any way we can persuade you to run for office? Please.
I'm now 92. If you can guarantee me 10 more years with no disability, I'll take it up.
It is just so great to see you as vibrant and persuasive as you were when I was a child. It's just so great. Thank you for coming.
Oh, Sam Patton, our former supervisor.
Two supervisors ago.
A related kind of question. The first time I got to vote for president was Eisenhower, which, you know, you're a little older than I am, but not a whole lot. And I had to go to court to do that, because there was if you remember, there was a crowd whose side was going to be there.
Yeah.
And I could not vote for that because I wasn't then 21.
Yeah.
But I went back and said, oh no, the rule says if you can vote for the presidential one, you can also vote for the other one. So I had to go to court to do that. But Eisenhower did something that I've never forgotten. Now, one of the first things he did was update the taxes on the wealthiest people then to 50%. And within 4 or 5 years, he just about cut off the Second World War problem.
Yeah.
All that money.
Yeah.
I don't see that happening now for somebody saying that if they're people, the wealthiest 1,000 people in this country can turn about 98 or 99% of all the money we have. Why can't we say that those people are getting all the advantages they get? They should also help us pay for it.
That's an appealing idea. The problem is that the kind of needs we have would be, you can't look to them to solve the problem, and they don't have that much money, as many billions as they have.
Well, you could ask one of the men who's running for president. He seems to think he can get the world.
I don't think that would work.
I'll jump in there, Sam, because I've thought about it a lot. One, if you look at the 1950s and late 40s, the rest of the world was not a competitor. Europe was war-torn, a lot of Asia was war-torn, and we were pretty much the only intact industrialized democracy, so we didn't have to compete with the world the way we do today in that window of time during the Eisenhower years. And businesses are more mobile than ever, and money is more mobile than ever. So even if you attempted to tax the wealthiest 1, 2, 3, 4, 10%, you could have the policy, but would it bring in the kind of revenue you're hoping for? The way money is so mobile and can be moved overseas, we've seen companies repatriate to overseas markets so that they can avoid some of the corporate tax. So I think on paper the math would work, but in practice the math probably wouldn't work in terms of bringing in the revenue.
Yeah, France tried that recently, and people moved out of France.
People are mobile too.
I got to tell you, you're absolutely right, but I think we need a drastic revision of the federal tax code. You know, you cannot let these folks keep moving their money around, and I think fair and just tax codes. Taxes provide an incentive, and right now the incentive seems to be chasing the money out. We need to incentivize to bring the money back in, but I couldn't agree with you more.
You know, our congressional district doesn't have a Republican candidate yet, so maybe we'll get one out of this room. You know, Senator Buckley had very few requirements. It said he wanted a microphone, he wanted water, and he said only one question from Don Minnie, so.
All right, this is my last question for you. Kind of off track with the book and everything, but it has to do with everything, really. Have you given a thought of any of the candidates running for president next year?
I've given a certain amount of thought. I think there's some very interesting people who are offering themselves. I believe that the kind of experience a governor has and has demonstrated is extremely useful for the managerial problems that are involved with the federal government, even though we have some very bright senators there. But I'm not going to make any particular judgment until I've had a chance to see these people in action. My great regret is that the first the first debate that's going to come up is limited to the top 10 people who happen to be there now, and mostly because they're better known, not because they've got better qualities. I wish that Fox would say, okay, we'll have 2 debates and mix them up and let the people in this room watch the various people, hear how they express themselves, hear what their particular views are, and then start making judgments as to who ought to belong in that top 3 or 4.
Yeah. Senator, in regards to your thoughts on term limits, I understand the founding fathers had some very raucous debates over that topic, and in the end they decided against it, I believe, for the simple fact that you have a term limit at every election. Now, that being said, grants and earmarks have muddied the water on that, and that's precisely why you see senators and congressmen sticking around for 20, 30 years, because they always bring home the pork.
Yeah.
An argument that I heard that might facilitate what you're trying to accomplish is basically close down Washington. In other words, you have computers now, you have secure internet vessels that they can communicate through via video conference, they can vote online. So essentially there's no real reason for a congressman to ever leave home. I mean, they can have committee meetings online, and the argument, and this isn't my thought, I heard this discussed on a radio show, I'm not the smartest person in the room by any means, but it was a compelling argument because if your congressman is home, they're going to the diner every morning, they're getting their hair cut at the local barber shop, they're shopping at the local stores, and they are visibly seeing the negative and or positive effects of their votes almost immediately. And they're getting feedback right away. What's your thought on that?
Well, it's an interesting. I never heard that proposition before, and I know that I'm of an age where I find telecommunication kind of difficult. I like to be right there seeing people's expressions and so on. But that was, in fact, how things worked in the first 150 years of our existence, because they were home. They were leading normal lives, and they get to get the static and, just what you described. But that's a fascinating idea. Now, of course, one thing you could do is just turn off the air conditioning.
Yes.
Washington would empty yourself out.
Yeah.
My only concern about that idea is Chinese hackers.
I think exactly.
Okay. How
Very
can we
good.
be secure?
There's nothing to worry about, there's no security when we're around.
Yeah.
Keep it separated from lobbyists.
John, I'll get you next, Keith.
Thank you for being here, Senator. My question is, in your opinion, how do people that hold the same beliefs that you do take a message of government accountability and spending accountability to the inner cities, to urban areas, and communicate the message effectively and win? In 1970, you won Queens, Staten Island, Westchester, all the suburbs. How do we do that again? How do we replicate that?
The problem we've had in the inner cities now is a deeply disturbing one, and it's not just blacks and Hispanics; it's whites as well. There's an interesting book by Charles Murray, saying we're becoming divided into two separate societies, not by ethnicity, but by habits. The question of the family. The disillusion of the family is a dramatic problem socially. You've got kids growing up with nobody to discipline them, no reason to hope, and so on. I don't have an answer for that. I just don't. Not something I've focused on. I don't know if I focused on it, but I would have an answer. But I just have a feeling that you're going to have to, one way or another, get children, well, the kind of education they're not getting in the middle cities. Reform schools would probably be better off, or more adoptions would be better off for them than the kind of lives that too many of them live. I don't have all the answers.
Let me just say, it's kind of ironic that topic would come up, because I think your 1972 opponent, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, was onto that in his work as a scholar, kind of the breakdown of the family.
At a time when the illegitimate births are 26% in those cities instead of 60-some-odd%.
Keith.
Thank you, Senator, for coming for this presentation. Are you familiar with ALEC?
With who?
ALEC.
No.
It's a congregation of local senators or state senators that get together as a result of potentially, possibly, corporate lobbyists.
Yeah.
And they gather together and they try to come to some sort of agreements, and then on the federal level, have it litigated that creates state mandates.
Yeah.
What would you do about lobbyists that create these types of mandates from the federal government onto states?
I found, incidentally, in my day, lobbyists were not vehicles for campaign financing. That came about in 1974 when they changed the rules on individual contributions to candidates. I found lobbyists very useful. It'd be an issue as to which I had no preconceived idea, didn't know the facts and so on. I asked my staff to get the best lobbyists on this side of the issue and the best lobbyists on the other. And they would give me, in short order, sophisticated arguments in favor of both positions. But it's one thing to listen to lobbyists, and they have a legitimate reason for being existed under the old system. But I would not buy their particular pleas for special treatment of their industry at the expense of everybody else. One of the things that I would do in the tax code, get rid of all the special provisions for businesses. I personally have always considered big business the enemy rather than the friend of people of my political persuasion. If they're looking for favors, they're not looking for free competition.
I have another question, Senator. I think most people agree that separation of powers and the power of the executive have shifted dramatically over 40 years, but especially during this administration, even the negotiations with Iran are almost wholly in the executive, and the Senate's advising consent role isn't present. On immigration, the president has acted unilaterally, and I've seen it bleed into our state. Our governor, just the other day, through a board, but essentially through executive fiat, raised the minimum wage for fast food restaurants because it couldn't get it done in the legislature. And it seems like Congress and the state legislature is incapable of stopping power grab by the executive. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Again, I hope the Supreme Court will have the occasion to slap the president down. It takes time for these issues to ever get there. But to me, it is the job of the president is to execute the laws that Congress adopts, whether he likes them or not. He has a chance to veto them, but not to ignore them. And yet, this is what he's been doing and getting away with it.
Right. Do you see any recourse for the? Seems like the only recourse is shutting down the government, which is politically unpalatable.
Yeah.
Congressional
I think
testosterone.
Adopt the recommendations here, and then you end up cutting the work done by congressmen in half, and you can then hope that they will then take the bite and go after the president themselves.
Okay.
Yeah. Easier said than done.
Right. Any other questions? Question, man?
Actually, I just want to, a lot of the questions asked, how are we going to change things? We do not have a magic wand. You have to be informed. We have to be informed. I mean, this book is a very easy read. I recommend everybody buy the book, get informed, bring the message back to the community, talk to your neighbors, to the elected officials, bring these concerns to them, whether it's in our localities, whether it's in the state. They have to know the issues that are important to us. So please buy the book. It's an easy read. I didn't finish reading it. I started it, but I will finish it. And this is how we get the job done. I want to thank everybody for participating. I want to thank the senator for coming to our town. It's a pleasure. It's an honor. And I want to thank the assemblyman for doing this. Thank you, everybody.